thank you all for joining, so I didn't have to call you to the table. Perfect. Thank you very much for joining us. And looks like Ms. Posey and Mr. Nieder are ready, so we will officially call our Finance Committee to order. Sorry, these are in front of me. I was like, what is this? These are minutes, not the agenda. We'll officially call our meeting to order. Thank you all for joining us for our Finance Committee meeting today. And the first order of business for the board is to approve our minutes from October 17th.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, please note by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. The motion carries and the minutes are approved. And I will now turn it over to Ms. Posey and Mr. Nieder.
All right. I hope you can hear me okay. My voice is a little hoarse. The fall allergies have gotten to me. But on today's agenda, we have a review of the annual comprehensive financial report. You'll also hear us refer to that as the ACFR for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2023. Each year, we have an external audit firm conduct a comprehensive review of the Wake County Public School System financial statements. The financial audit report has been approved by the Local Government Commission. Tyler Beatty, a partner with Forbes, the external audit firm, presented the financials to the board's audit committee on November 17, 2023. And Tyler is here in the audience as well. We are one of the few school systems nationally, and to the best of our knowledge, the only school system in North Carolina to have an audit committee. The purpose of the audit committee, as established in Board Policy 8810, is to assist the board in the process of procuring an independent audit firm, reviewing the audit of the financial statements before presenting them to the board, and assisting in obtaining effective corrective action and necessary improvement based on audit findings and recommendations received from the external auditors. The policy directs the board to nominate members of the committee with a strong financial management or related background. The current membership of the committee represents that, and there is also one attorney. Today we have with us the audit committee chair and vice chair to share the audit committee report on the financials. Laird Hepburn is the committee chair. He is a CFP and financial management partner at his firm, and Vice Chair Faith Bynum Patterson, who is a CPA, MBA, and business owner. Followed by them will be Tyler Beatty, a partner with Forbes, who will present a summary of the audit from the perspective of the external auditors. Following their presentation, I will share highlights of the report, and Mr. David Nieder will share a couple of remarks before we begin our presentation.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, before we begin, I just wanted to, put some context and contrast, perhaps more importantly, between the annual financial report you're going to hear about, as Ms. Posey described, and the board's budget, which the board has just spent the better part of, for the current year, the better part of the past 12 months reviewing. And I believe it was at your second October meeting that you were finally in a position, once the state finished their budget for the year, to approve a final budget. And I want to just draw a distinction, because even though they're tied in some ways, they both are financial perspectives on the finances of the Board of Education and the district. They're very different and distinct. The budget is a forward-looking thing, if you will. It's a forecast. It's a planning tool moving forward. So the board's 23-24 budget is guiding us through the fiscal year. To contrast that, though, to the ACFR, or Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, this is a look in the rearview mirror. It's after the fact. Don't read anything into the after the fact of them, just it's a statement of fact. And it's a representation of the financial position of the district. And so they are two very different things. And with that said, I think I'm going to leave it with that. And Ms. Posey, I'm going to turn it back to you.
All right. Well, we'll begin. So Laird was unable to attend the audit committee, but he has reviewed the financials. But Vice Chair Ms. Fina Patterson was able to attend the audit committee on November 17th and will actually share her remarks.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Faith Bynum Patterson here, and it is a pleasure to see everyone. As Ms. Posey has stated, we met this past Friday, and it's always, I always refer to audits and ACFRs as a report card. So it's always great to be able to say that our unmodified opinion, it reflects just the excellence and the integrity of our the staff, and as well as the auditors. Tyler, he's so amazing with his detailed representation and the questions. And there were not many questions from the audit committee, just mainly around continuing to understand OPEB liabilities. And I myself, I'm still wrapping my head around all of this because it's definitely in depth. But outside of that, it was a great meeting. There were no concerns that we discussed outside of just the general clarifying questions. And overall, unless Laird has anything to add, I think
I've got nothing to add today.
Yeah. Today is the great word for Laird. But outside of that, I think we're really good. So thank you. Thank you.
All right. There's no questions for the audit committee. Then we'll
None for me, I should clarify, I attended the audit committee, and of course, I also acknowledge we have new board members, so are there questions about the audit committee, who makes up the audit committee before we move forward?
I just want to thank the both of you and your committee. I know this is a volunteer position. I know that this is one more thing on top of what you already have to do in your day jobs, and just thank you for volunteering to do this and being that reflection of the community and making sure we're able to see this and understand it, and getting that outside perspective is always
Absolutely.
helpful.
And we invite board members to put forward names of people who ought to be on this committee so that fresh faces can come in.
A little sticky note for the end.
Fair
And I would just add that your board policy that governs this committee recommends that you look for individuals with either a financial background, financial management, business background, or similar. And as Ms. Posey mentioned, we do have currently an attorney on the firm. We have attorneys on the firm in the past, because that provides them the basis to truly advise the board independently on something that is financial centric.
Thank you. And you were not there, but I understand we had a conversation about were you remaining our chair moving forward, since you were not there on the.
Well, seeing as there's been nothing done yet, I'm still the chair.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so Tyler Beatty, partner with Forbes, our external audit firm, will present on their representation of the financial.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I see a lot of familiar faces here, but for those who are new, I just wanted to introduce Forbes. So we're a public accounting firm. We're a top 10 firm in the United States. We have over 6,000 team members. As Tricia mentioned, my name is Tyler Beatty. I sit in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and I help lead our North Carolina school district practice. Maybe before we get into the presentation today, let's see, am I working good?
Tyler, let me I think, because I had a similar challenge.
Hopefully we can get into the presentation today.
Or we will have a manual.
Yeah. I'm going to have to say next.
Yes, next.
slide.
Yes.
David, you didn't know you were going to have this responsibility today, huh?
No, sir.
It's me. Thank you.
There we go.
Is it working? Got it. All righty. Thank you. He used to always say, you never start a meeting without IT people in the room. But, anyways, thank you for that. Before we do get started in the presentation, I do think it's important to just thank the Wake County Finance team, Tricia, Jadette, and Robin in the back in particular. We've had the pleasure of working with them for a few years now, and they've been a pleasure to work with. And as you'll see, and as folks probably remember from the past couple of years, we've had a lot of significant transition in school finance over these past few years. You guys had the transition of the accounting team with Mark's retirement. We've had all these new additional COVID funding. And on top of that, we've had to implement some pretty significant new accounting standards over these last couple of years. You might remember the leasing standard from last year, and then we had a new GASB 96, which is a subscription-based technology standard. So it's definitely not been status quo. There's been new things to look at every year. And so through all of that, it's important to mention that the ACFR was released and accepted by the LGC before the October 31st deadline. And the audit, the single audit's also been submitted to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. Alrighty, so my agenda today, and again, as you guys remember from prior years, we'll keep this presentation fluid, so we'll have time at the end of the discussion or the presentation for questions, but if something pops up in between them, please stop me, and I'm happy to go over it on each specific slide. But what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about the audit results. We'll talk about our required communications to the board as auditor. We'll review some financial highlights that we've extracted from the ACFR, and then we'll take a quick look at our compliance or single audit that we also performed in accordance with the financial statement audit. So the first slide is a discussion of the audit results. So maybe most importantly, and maybe somebody will surprise me one day, but I don't ever remember anyone discussing an audit or an audit process is fun, right? I think there's a lot of work that goes into it, and quite honestly, all that work, you get one deliverable, right? And it's 3 pages in this ACFR that's our audit opinion on the financial statements. And so what I have extracted on this slide is what's considered an unmodified opinion. And so in accounting, an unmodified opinion is a good thing, and what that lets folks know is it lets report readers of this ACFR know that the information and the financial information included in this ACFR is materially accurate. And our entire audit report can be found on page 1 of the ACFR, but the unmodified opinion is the report you want to receive, and again, it lets everybody know that the information here has been audited and is materially accurate as they're analyzing the ACFR. Secondly, we'll talk about some things that are required communications to the board, and so along with this ACFR, we did issue a separate deliverable that was submitted to the LGC and approved. Tricia, I believe you have copies of it now. Was that sent across to this team, or will continue to be public information? Our communications report, the one that...
That is, it's been posted in
Okay.
Assembly, and it will actually, along with the actual financial document,
Okay.
It'll be on our website.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so the communication report, it is our separate deliverable. Again, it gets missed at times, but what our separate communication report does is it houses certain required communications that we're required to have with the Board of Education as part of pursuant to our professional standards. So kind of bifurcating the information in that report, the first section has our overviews and responsibilities, and it's on page 1. And what this does, it describes our responsibility as auditors, but it also describes the management and the board's responsibilities relating to that audit. Any significant estimates or sensitive disclosures included in this ACFR report, they're disclosed in there. We've identified the significant estimates as your useful lives of your depreciable assets, the proportionate share of your net pension and your net net pension and net OPEB liabilities, as well as some estimates that have to be used in regards to lease term and incremental borrowing rates in order to calculate and report any leasing liabilities or any subscription liabilities in accordance with 87 to 96. Maybe most importantly, if there were any difficulties or disagreements with management that we had during our audit process, it would be communicated in this report. Similar to prior years, we didn't have any difficulties or disagreements. Also, if there were any uncorrected misstatements, so if we identified a misstatement as part of our audit process and it wasn't corrected by management, we would communicate that uncorrected misstatement in this report. Again, we didn't have any uncorrected misstatements that arose as of audit procedures. And then lastly, we do have a management representation letter attached in the appendix of this report, and this is just to give report readers the understanding of what representations were given to us as part of the audit process. All right, and now we'll quickly go through some financial highlights. And again, what we've done is taken some of the most pertinent information from the ACFR, extracted it from that, and presented in graphical form, so it's just a little bit easier to digest than having you flip through 169 pages of the ACFR. So the first slide is revenues, and so what this shows is your state, your county, and other local and your federal revenues, not only for fiscal year 2023, but 2022 and 2021. So on the very left slide, which is the red bar, is your state funding, and obviously, as you can see, it's the largest funding source of the board. In fiscal year 2023, it did increase right around $49 million as compared to fiscal year 2022. 41 of the 49 was related to the state public school fund. And one thing we always like to mention is, as part of the state and the state public school fund, the majority of that funding is related to positional allotments for personnel and payroll. And so with the rising of retirement rates and employee costs, there would be instances where you could get the same positional allotment year over year, even though the dollar funding increased. So that's important to consider. So maybe moving on to the middle bar, this is your county and other local funding. In total, it decreased right around $7 million in fiscal year 2023 when compared to fiscal year 2022. However, there was an increase of approximately $50 million in your local county appropriation. And so this is the local money that's generally recorded in Fund 2 as a supplement from the county to the school district. So that actually increased. Coupled with that increase was a decrease in $61 million, which was related to county capital funding. And so this county capital funding obviously ebbs and flows depending on the amount of construction activity that's going on with the school district. And typically, it's a combination of actual county funding flowing through in addition to construction contracts and other things that are paid by the county on behalf of the school district. And again, this money is going to ebb and flow dependent on the construction activity that's going on each fiscal year. The only other thing to mention is that your other local increased right around $6 million, and these are things like tuition payments and other service fees received by the board. All right, lastly, the black bar. As you can see, this is your federal funding, and kind of as expected, as we've talked previously about your COVID funding and your COVID-related funds, we saw in 2021 it was $117 million, then increased drastically to $284, and now it's ebbing back down to $172. So we saw a decrease of total federal funding for your governmental funds of right around $112 million. That decrease is driven primarily from your Education Stabilization Fund, which is the COVID money that decreased $81 million in fiscal year 23 compared to fiscal year 2022. It's important to note that, however, even though it did decrease, the board still received $94 million of Education Stabilization Fund allotments in fiscal year 2023. That program is set to expire in September 30th, 2024, so while you'll probably have some continued money from the Education Stabilization Fund, this next fiscal year that we're in right now is probably the last allotments for that before that program sunsets. So again, for budgeting and planning purposes, and as we talk about fund balance, we'll see that it was increasing. There was reasoning for that because there's a big pot of money that's about to sunset. Next slide, I think this was a layered special presentation over here. So I think this slide
that was going to be in there.
This is the one and only slide that makes the Wake Public Schools presentation and not any of the others. But what this is, and I actually really appreciate it. So this is the same metrics that we discussed on the previous slide, but it's shown as a pie chart instead of graphical representation. So again, as we discussed, you can tell really easily that very right's your state funding as you think about the Board of Education, and then the dark red is your county and local funding. And then you see, even given the volatility in your federal funding, it still makes up just a small piece of the overall funding received by the Board of Education each fiscal year. Alrighty, next slide. So what this is your total governmental expenditures, and what it is showing the ratio between your expenditures that are spent on instructional services, which would be your 5,000 purpose codes as stipulated by the Department of Public Instruction, and then that other other bar is your supporting services, would be your 6,000 and 7,000 purpose codes. And so what this tries to do is give you a visual representation of where monies are being spent each year. And again, you'll notice that the board has consistently spent around 80% on instructional services, with the remaining 20% being spent on operational services. So as auditors, we would expect consistency in this ratio year over year, and obviously this slide indicates such consistency. Also important to note, there was a slight dip in instructional services this year, with supporting services going up 0.4%, but this increase is attributable to some of the ECF, the Education Stabilization Fund monies, and how that was spent. So things such as cleaning supplies or certain repairs and maintenance and things like that, those are coded to a 6,000 purpose code, which would show up in other, even though it's probably worth a conversation if you're cleaning or doing work at a school as an instructional or other. So again, that's what the slight increase, decrease, volatility between this year and the prior year is, and it made sense to us as auditors of why there was a little bit of volatility in 23 compared to 22. Alrighty, next slide. So this is your general fund balance. So this would be your Fund 2 fund balance. As of, again, it's just a snapshot in time, which I think, David, was a good point you made earlier. This is just a snapshot at June 30th, 2023, 2022, and 2021. As you can see, your total fund balance, which is the very left orange bar, it did increase $9.3 million in 23 compared to 2022. As we previously discussed about the Education Stabilization Fund, what an increase in local fund balance tells us is the board is continuing to be able to utilize the additional federal and state funding related to COVID-19. And again, to reiterate one more time, these funds are sunsetting, right? So I think David and Tricia will be talking about what that money is used for, but some of this fund balance that's been built up over the past few years will need to be utilized to continue some of those services as the programs sunset. So the gray bar in the middle, so this is your available for appropriation fund balance. The difference between your available for appropriation and your total fund balance is there's certain restrictions that are in place because of general statute, where you have to restrict the fund balance so it's not available to appropriate for anything. Two big things would be inventory. So your inventory on hand at the end of each fiscal year, it's an asset, so it's a component of fund balance, but that money's already spent, so you can't then appropriate that fund balance related to inventories. The second piece is any receivables that's outstanding at the end of the year. So state statute won't allow you to appropriate fund balance until the money's received. So that delta is two big things: your inventory at the end of the year and your receivables at the end of the year. And then lastly, your unassigned fund balance, which is the black bar on the very right side. And so again, your unassigned fund balance, it increased by right around $6 million in the current year, which is extremely consistent with your total fund balance increase. The slight difference is due to additional assigned amounts for certain special projects, as well as the appropriated fund balance in fiscal year 2023. And your total assigned fund balance, the detail of what it's been assigned for, what it's going to be used for, can be found on page 60 of the physical ACFR.
I had a question, but it was answered. Thank you.
Alrighty, next slide. So again, this is kind of a regurgitation of the information before, but what this shows is your general fund balance as a percentage of governmental expenditures. So again, as you can see in the available for appropriation and the unassigned fund balance, both increase, which tells us that it's a combination of two things. Your total fund balance increase, so obviously this ratio would increase, but also your expenditures year over year decrease slightly, which is also driving the increase of this ratio. One thing we like to do is convert this to days. So if we looked at this as effectively your fund balance is your savings account, right? So if we converted this to days, how many days of our savings account can we fund the board? So your total fund balance is approximately 22 days, while your unassigned fund balance is approximately 10 days of operating expenditures. So there's no state mandated threshold for fund balance for school districts in North Carolina, and again, a lot of it's got to do with the relationship with the county, depending on how much fund balance effectively the respective county lets the school district hold. It is important to note, though, if you go talk to a financial planner, if we talked to Laird and told him we had 20 days in our savings account operating, he would say increase it.
It's a little bit low.
Yeah, yeah. So, I was listening to Dave Ramsey this morning. He always says 3 to 6 months, right? So we're at 22
Depending upon
and 10
how hard
days.
it is to replace.
Yeah, yeah. So, but again, and Tricia and David will get into it later, but I think the ability, we've kind of seen with the ARA money and the economic reception that happened almost 10 years ago now, we're seeing history repeat itself in most districts and most diligent districts using this ability of extra funding to increase fund balance. And I think, as you guys have probably budgeted and seen, the majority of the COVID money was used for one-time expenditures, but there is some recurring things and holes in the budget that we're going to have to utilize this fund balance to fill. Alrighty. As I mentioned earlier, so Forvis, we were engaged to do a financial statement audit for the Board of Education, and this is extremely similar to, call it private company audits, where you're engaged to do a financial statement audit. In addition to the financial statement audit, because Wake Public Schools is a governmental entity and receives federal and state funding, we also have to do what's known as a single audit or a compliance audit. So I'd just like to share our results of those compliance type audits. So again, as part of government auditing standards, we're required to evaluate the board's compliance with laws, regulations, contracts and agreements and grant agreements. So if you flip back to the single audit section, that first report starts on page 130, is what's known as our Yellow Book report. So if there were any findings related to our compliance type audit, they would be summarized in there. And similar to prior years, we didn't have any reportable findings as a part of our Yellow Book report. Next, which is this slide, is in addition to the Yellow Book report, we're required to evaluate the board's compliance with federal programs that are deemed to be major. In the current year, we did have 2 programs that were identified as major as part of our auditing procedures. They were the Education Stabilization Fund and the Title I program. As noted in prior years, the Education Stabilization Fund has been identified as high risk by the Office of Management and Budget, so that means this funding pool of money will continue to be audited regardless of any professional judgment made by auditors. And we would expect this to continue for 1 more year until the fund sunsets. All of that to say, we did do procedures related to these programs in accordance with our professional standards, and as noted on the slide, we didn't have any reportable findings related to our audit of these 2 major programs. The next, similar to our analysis of federal programs, we're required to evaluate the board's compliance with state programs that are deemed to be major. In fiscal year 2023, we did have 2 programs which were considered major. It was the State Public School Fund, which is required to be audited every year, as well as the driver's training program. And again, as part of our testing and procedures over those 2 programs, we didn't have any reportable findings related to those 2 programs. So that concludes my presentation. Happy to go in more detail about anything or answer any questions that the Finance Committee may have.
Dr. Ng.
If you can just explain, you mentioned about purpose codes.
Yes.
Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think probably what's most helpful to look at would be page 16. Yeah, maybe page 15 and 16. So, your chart of accounts is dictated by the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. So effectively what that means is the board has well, for consistency, the chart of accounts used at Wake Public Schools along with every other district has a similar chart of accounts. So part of that chart of accounts, there's one subsection that's just how the board presents its financial statements called purpose code, a purpose code. So basically, based on the nature of activity or expenditures each year, depending on the nature of the expenditure incurred, it's reported and accounted for in a respective purpose code. So like on page 15, you'll notice you have your instructional programs and it's regular special populations, alternative school leadership, so on and so forth. And then you have your system-wide support service purpose codes, which starts at support and development and goes all the way down to policy, leadership, and public relations. So that slide that we showed was basically taking your overall instructional service expenses with the system-wide support services and showing a ratio of well, how much is spent on instructional service as opposed to system-wide support services. So the other comment that I made is certain items such as like custodial cleaning and things like that that occurs directly at the schools, there's no ambiguity or ability to code it. It's basically coded where DPI says for it to be coded. So certain things like cleaning and custodial service at the schools, is that a instructional related expense or is it a support related expense? My point is there's no differentiator there. It's coded as support services. So. Long-winded answer. Hopefully that helps.
Ms. Evans?
Where is the best place in this book to refer to fund balance information?
Yeah, great question. So, a couple ways.
I'm sure it's mentioned throughout, but if you could.
Yeah, this is quite a chapter book, isn't it?
102 and 103.
Thank you. What'd you say?
And
102.
we'll cover that in our presentation.
102 and 103.
Oh, yeah, you went to different pages than I would have, so.
And I'm
Is that the
sorry.
statistical section?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot for somebody else's.
No. She gave you a better answer than I would, because I was going to give you the current year, whereas Tricia pointed you to. So because you guys do an ACFR, which it reports more information than the basic financial statements, and what it also does is it's not a requirement. Most districts just report a financial statement, so it wouldn't have this information. But because you guys present an ACFR, it includes statistical information that not only includes the current year, but also includes the non-prior years, which gives you a lot, it tells the story better of not only where you're at today, but where you've been. So I was about to point you to the basic financial statements, which was less information than what you guys presented.
We're explaining that.
Yeah.
Acronym.
Oh, I'm sorry. We changed acronyms over the past few years, didn't we? So it used to be something else, now it's an ACFR.
Yeah.
I think you literally just switched the letters around.
They did.
They did.
They did. Happy to clap.
Is there a front?
Close. That's the next one.
Does that answer your question for you, Ms.?
Yeah, okay, perfectly.
I don't see any other questions, thank you.
All righty. Well, again, I appreciate the time here today. I'm going to sit around and hang out for y'all's presentation. But our contact information, it is in that communications report. And so if anything additional is needed, I'm sure Tricia and David will loop us in. And we're happy to answer any questions if they come up after the fact. So turn this back over to you.
Thank you very much. Wait for this presentation to come up. All right, well, I will now share highlights of the ACFR with you. I would first like to thank all of those involved in ensuring the accuracy of our financial reporting. This includes school bookkeepers, our lead secretaries, department support staff, school and central service budget managers, our financial services teams, including accounting, compensation services, purchasing, risk management, fiscal administrators, and the budget and human resources teams. I would also like to thank Ms. Jeanette Fuller, our Senior Director of Accounting, as well as Robin Presley, so you all remember Robin Presley, for their work in generating all of the schedules organizing the document, and verifying the accuracy of the data. Truly takes a team.
Well, I had a color comment, and Tyler referenced this. We are one of the probably few districts in the entire state that produce our own annual comprehensive financial report. The only one, I hear Ms. Presley say. So that's a real distinguished.
Thank you. All right. So we will provide an overview of the ACFR, review the fund balance, as well as our spending impact on the local economy. The ACFR is split out in 4 sections. You have the introductory, financial, statistical, and the single audit, as you heard some of those things from Mr. Beatty. The letter of transmittal in the introductory section, this provides information on the county, the school system, and the audit process. On pages Roman numeral 9 and 10, you will see that the board received the Award of Excellence from the Association of School Business Officials International and the Government Finance Officers Association. And this is the 34th consecutive year. The financial section begins on page 1 and includes the independent audit report and the management discussion and analysis. That's also referred to as the MD&A. The MD&A begins on page 5, and this summarizes the financial performance for the fiscal year. The net position of the board increased by $328.5 million for the year ending June 30th, 2023. So our total net position was $1.96 billion at year end. The financial reports begin on page 14. These reports include detailed statements of the net position of assets and liabilities, followed by revenues and expenditures, and the balance sheets for all funding sources. This also includes the notes to the financial statements, which begin on page 28. The statistical section begins on page 95 and runs through page 129. This section provides global information about the school system and the county. The schedules associated with the county are directly from the Wake County Government Financial Report. We do want to note that in this section, if you turn to page 128 in your book, there is a technical correction. In the column 2023, the transportation number of buses is listed at 967. This is the total fleet. The actual number of in-service buses is 577. We've confirmed with Forbes, our external auditor, that this figure does not impact our financials and serves as an information item. We will update our fiscal year 2024 ACFR with the corrected figure for 2023. All right, so we are now going to get into some details that I know you'll really enjoy. So we're going to look at our per pupil expenditures. We'll start on page 105. And it's also reflected on page 106. So as you look across the top for the 2023 school year, you'll see that the total, this includes operating and capital outlay, the per pupil is $13,448. And that total capital and outlay was $2.12 billion. And if you look to two columns to the left, you'll see the total operating at $12,104 per pupil. So if we stop building schools or renovating schools today, our total operating cost and per pupil would be $12,104, and that's what we're currently at. So on page 105, Tyler referred to this as well. Our instructional services is at $1.5 billion, and this remains at 80% of the total operating cost, and accounts for $9,631 per pupil. Now, it's important to note on the non-program charges, so this is on page 105 in the very last column, this number includes our payments to charter schools. We paid $57.6 million to charter schools in fiscal year 2023. That translates to $364 per pupil, which is not realized by our students. To show some additional information on charter schools, we provided a 5-year history of local funding for charter schools. You'll see that in fiscal year 2023, the charter school number has gone up. It consists of 9.6% of Wake County students attending public schools compared to fiscal year 2019, where we had 7.8% of charter school students attending within Wake County Public Schools. And we also noted that in the non-program charges, charter schools make up about 96% of that figure in the non-program charges.
What is the 96%?
So the non-program charges for 2023
Yeah.
is $61.7 million. Charter school payments are 96% of that figure.
Mr. Harder.
And Ms. Posey, can you give us a little more information on how that charter school portion is calculated? Is there a regular funding formula for that? Is it the same formula that we use for public schools? Or what determines how much of that 61 goes to the charter schools?
Absolutely. So on your page 105 and 106, you'll see that the membership is $158,357 for the school district. This is just Wake County's membership. So when Ms. Fuller does the calculation for charter schools, they take our total membership in addition to the charter school memberships, and that total is then divided into the revenues that we've received for that period of time. And Jeanette does this monthly. So every month, she does a calculation of revenues received, so all local revenues that are subject to charter school payments, divides it by the total population of all Wake County students that attend public education, and then everybody receives that per pupil amount. So they will receive that per pupil amount.
Chair Johnson, may I continue? Yes. So if I understand what you've just told me, I want to rephrase it. We calculate a per student cost based on what the cost is to educate a student in Wake County Public Schools. And then we allocate that number, that rate of cost for each charter student that is identified as a Wake County student attending a charter school. And that's true even if the charter school is not in Wake County. Is that correct?
Yes, if the child is eligible. So say they're on the border of Johnson County and they're attending a charter school in Johnson County, but they are officially a Wake County student, yes, we do pay that.
So it's not necessarily based on the actual cost of education of that student, rather it's just an average based
It's the
on...
revenues that come in, and they receive the revenues. It's not based on expenditure. It is a calculation per pupil amount of the revenues we've received.
Okay. And just for my fellow board members, the reason why I'm so interested in this, when we started looking at our student population base, especially during the pandemic, and we saw where students in Wake County were actually attending schools, it really shocked me that we had students that were attending charter schools in like Carteret County or on the coast, but that we were getting charged for it in Wake County because somehow the parent was claiming Wake County residency, but that's where the child was attending school. And obviously there'd be a difference between like a Wake County cost of living and a standard and what we might see in other parts of the state. So
And definitely more revenue for us.
yeah. It's a higher cost for us. So I didn't know how far we went into that with the formula, so I appreciate that clarification. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Harder.
Thank you.
Sorry, yes. Oh.
The calculation is the total amount of students in Wake County per PM plus the total amount of the charter schools per PM. That total is then used to make the calculation of the total revenues collected with that PM. That's how I'm doing it.
So to translate that for my own benefit, there's no actual cost estimate that's given to Wake County by any charter school on how much they might actually spend. It's all done based on the costs that Wake County incurs. Is that correct?
Based upon our revenues, yes.
Yeah,
that's
and Mr. Haggerty, a slight distinction. It's truly, if you think about the county appropriation, and we have other local revenues beyond the county appropriation, but the county appropriation now is approximately $640 million, $644, I think. If we receive that $640-some million in a year, but we don't spend it all, we still wind up giving that pro rata share of the entire amount, even though we didn't spend it all, to the charter schools. So it's not just what we expend or not just our cost, it's truly based on the revenue of the city.
Thank you.
But to your point too, it's charter school get it based on roster. There's no exercise to determine the cost of that student being at the charter school. So it's just purely based on local expense and the ratio of charter schools compared to the total population of eligible students in the county.
Or the cost we're incurring per student. It's
Exactly.
literally just
Yeah.
revenue. Mr. Swanson?
And along those lines, even if the student does not return, if the student returns to Wake County, those dollars from that charter school, we do not get back. Is that
At a
accurate?
period in time, it should change the roster. I mean, today, you're probably getting rosters every month.
Yes.
But there's no like retroactive reimbursement from the charter school. It just stops at that point in time as the roster's updated, and then the entire population ratio is updated.
So, if I may,
Yes.
so I know the first 10 days are very critical for head count to make sure that we have the numbers of students, teachers, and staff in the buildings. After that 10-day head count, does that, let's say we get 10 or 20 different students back from a charter, our numbers are already set for our staff. How does that play into you all's formula? How do we ensure that, those students that are coming back, we have enough staff and to support those students?
So the basic distinction is that when we talk about students returning to the district, we have to delineate between state funding and local funding. And so with the state funding, they're going to get that, and when those students return after those 10 days, then we don't get any money back. So that's where you see charters will have, I shouldn't say charters do this, but if any kid comes back after that point, we don't get any money back from them. That's our state allocation that goes directly from the state to the charter. But local revenue, that's why we keep a monthly roster, so that if those kids do come back, we don't keep sending that money. I would imagine maybe 12 or 13 years ago, a lot of districts began to look at monthly rosters because we would send the money every month and kids would come back, and they never made a distinction, and so you could actually stop it. So when it's state revenue, if they come back after a certain point of the year, we don't get any rebate. But if they do come back and our numbers increase, I think it's by 100 students, then we can begin to see changes in our state revenue. But it's the local funding that we can actually stop by looking at those monthly rosters. So you all might want to add to that, but that's...
No, you said
No,
perfect.
all set.
Yeah.
Ms. Kinsey?
One thing, just to remind you, at your previous board meeting, remember we asked for you to appropriate fund balance for targeted enrollment so that we can deal with things that come up unexpectedly during the year. So if we were to continue to grow in numbers of students after we receive the adjustment from the state, and after we're tweaking numbers each month for OTA charters, that's where we use those one-time resources, where we may need to address class issues or areas where we have a significant growth in students.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kinsey. Ms. Coffey?
Dr. Taylor, can you elaborate just a little bit more on what you were saying? Because I know this does come up. So at a certain point, you said that we don't get our state funds back. At what point is that, and what does that look like?
So
Yeah, look, Ms. Caulfield, our state funding, well, let me back up, and Ms. Kimsey, keep me honest with my response. Each year, the state projects the number of, the state will come up with a projection for how many students Wake County will have. And that's done in the prior year. And then when we receive our initial state funding from the state, it's based on that student projection. And as we know, many, perhaps even most of the state allotments are based on ADM or average daily membership. And so the number of students projected, which turns into the initial allotment for us, matters. They then have us look at our day, they call it the day 20 and the day 40 ADM, average daily membership. So again, it's not actual membership, it's an average of the first 20 days of the school and an average of the first 40 days of school. And after the 40th day, if our numbers come in lower than what was projected, the state pulls some of the allotment back. We actually can find a savings in that historically they have not pulled the entire amount back. They only pull half of what we didn't earn back. But now the flip is not quite so generous. If our student counts came in for those average 20 and 40 days came in higher than what was projected and higher than what we actually received resources from the state, we don't just get additional resources from the state. So now bringing the charters into play, and I'm going to use an extreme number just to make the point, but if we had 1,000 at the beginning of the year, if we counted in our average daily membership at average day 20 and average day 40, if there were, let's say, 1,000 students that were not in our ranks, they were out at charter schools. But after that 40th day, when the state reconciles with us, those 40 students, those 1,000 students came back to Wake County schools. We've got the cost of educating another 1,000 students, and we will not get any additional resources from the state. And what Dr. Taylor was saying is, for those first couple months, we were having to pay those charter schools the local portion, because we pay the local portion. But when those kids come back, the charter schools won't be able to charge us anymore for them. They won't be on the charters roster, so we won't have to keep paying the local resources out. I don't know if that helped.
Absolutely, thank you.
And so the only thing I would add is that with charter schools, they have a similar count with the state that, and I want to say it's day 20, but I may be wrong. I don't keep up with the charters business, but they have a set number. Let's say the charter school has an enrollment that the state allows them to have 500 students, so they can't go beyond that. And so they have a certain period to where whatever number they have, they report that to the state, and that's what they get revenue on. Now, after that count point, any of those students that come back, they don't lose the revenue. And that's what David is talking about. Even though we get them back, we don't get any additional revenue. So that's always been the rub when it comes to the state money, that once they return, nothing we can do. But local funding, we can't stop it because it's a monthly roster.
So state-wise, if I can recap, state funds, if the child moves, the funds don't move.
After the
But
count
charter, but the local funds will follow the student if they go back and forth. Okay. And that's provided the student.
Yeah. So that kind of goes what Mr. Haggerty talked about, that the majority of your charter students should be in Wake County and counties around, but you have instances where a kid could be all the way across the state, and I know that's where we question very heavily if indeed that's the case. But that's just a monthly fight, right?
So they can reside.
As long as they're residents of Wake County, doesn't matter where the charter school is, but
sometimes we'll have questions about residency too. They moved into the beach house or something.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's when domicile comes
Are there any further questions?
Thank you, Ms. Posey.
Thank you. So we're going to look at a little bit of history of fund balance. It is also part of the statistical section, and I referenced earlier pages 102 and 103. These provide a 10-year history of the fund balance. The top half of the schedules in 102 and 103 provide the fund balance on the general fund. And we'll discuss fund balance in great detail in a few minutes. But you'll see from the graph that in 2014, we were still a little high. That was part of, in 2012, we had the recession. You could still see a little bit of that in 2014 and what we were carrying in fund balance. And then again, you see a rise in 2020 through 2023 with the influx of the federal funding from COVID-19. The next section is the single audit section. It begins on page 130, as Mr. Beatty pointed out earlier. And this includes the independent auditor's report on internal control over financial reporting and compliance and other matters. We received no deficiencies in internal controls to be material weaknesses. And if you turn to page 138, you will see a summary of the auditor's results. And the school system did receive an unmodified opinion, meaning the audit was clean and the financials gave a true representation of the financial status of the school system. And an unmodified opinion with no findings is the goal of the school system. Next, we do have information a little bit more on the schedule of state federal awards, pages 142 and 144. In addition to what we received in COVID-19 Education Stabilization Fund, there is an additional amount of $6.2 million that was provided in special education. It was not the same federal, it's called Catalog of Federal, Tyler, the CFDA.
CFDA number, yeah.
CFDA
It wasn't
number.
under, it was still related to the COVID-19, but
Yes.
since it came through a different funding source, CFDA, it would have been grouped with the special education cluster
It did.
instead of the education stabilization fund.
But that $6.2 million is non-recurring.
That's
And
right.
so that is also something that we're looking at as part of the expenditures for COVID-19. We actually had $102 million in total. And in the book on pages 142, you'll see the U.S. Department of Education number as, what's that? 142. It's actually on 143. And a percentage of that number, we received 169.6 million in total U.S. Department of Education grant funding. And those COVID-19 funds make up 60% of that number.
A reminder how big this cliff is, Ms. Posey.
Yeah, remember, we have recurring and we have non-recurring
Yes.
items, yes. So we've made efforts to mitigate that as we move forward for the 24-25 year planning. So over the past 3 years, we have provided updates on the COVID-19 expenditures with the board and plan to bring an update in a finance committee in early 2024. Past presentations are available on the district's internet page under pandemic relief funds.
Ms. Coffin has a quick question, sorry. Ms.
Oh,
Posey.
yes.
I'm sorry. Referring to page 143, where you're saying the U.S. Department grant funding, right?
Mhm.
60% was the COVID funds.
Not the COVID funds, 60% of total federal funds. So at the bottom of page 143, you'll see it says total U.S. Department of Education, $169.6 million. So the COVID-19 funds make up 60% of that figure.
And it has all these things listed out. Where would we typically get that money before COVID? like prior to COVID, like what?
So
Is that too big a question?
So the standard grants that we have the entitlement grants, which include Title I, Title II, Title III, and Title IV. Title I is our largest of the entitlement grants, and you saw Mr. Beatty presented that was one of the ones that's included in the single audit because it is such a large number. We also receive IDEA funds. So IDEA funds are different. They fall under our special education services. And we received various numbers of grant awards that serve pre-K students as well as our K through age 21 age population for special ed. There's many grants in there that are typically competitive grants. We received the Indian Education Grant. It is competitive, so it is not something that is just provided to us, so we do have to apply for it. Those other programs are formula grants. And so those, as long as we do the application and we meet the qualifying factors, we tend to receive both the IDEA and the entitlement grants, Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV.
So if I'm understanding correctly, it was really like we got most of this from grant funds, but the COVID funds were
On
On top of.
Yeah, Ms. Caulfield, what Ms. Posey just shared were some of the standard recurring federal grants we receive each year, Title I, Title II, Title IV. But these COVID funds were also federal grant funds. But even though we had them for multiple years, think of them as one time as opposed to recurring, and one time for use over a period of about 4 years. But when one looks at the total amount we had over that period of time, including this one final year that we're in, it was almost $500 million that we received. And because of the significance in the total amount of these one-time COVID funds, that's why it makes up such a big percentage, or 60%, of our overall federal grant funds. But again, those drop off completely, those being the COVID
That's why I'm
funds.
wondering, when we snap back and we don't have that, where do we get it before that we're now going to have to use?
And that's,
Yeah.
So the way I would answer the question that you're asking, and I know what you're asking, you say, what did we do before? And so the majority of those COVID funds were to mitigate issues that we never had before. Buying materials for kids, dealing with learning loss when they were out of school. We've certainly used a lot of that funding to provide social, emotional support, things of that nature. Those are the things I think are going to be the big question of what do we do once those funds go away. But the majority of those funds were to deal with the mitigation of COVID, which is something that we never had before. But we do know that some things were exposed in terms of the support that kids need, and that's what we've got to focus in terms of what are we going to do now that those funds are going away. And so I think that's the question that you're asking, but a lot of the federal funds that we were already receiving and been receiving for decades, Title I programs, things of that nature. But the COVID funding was for mitigation, but now there's some things we will need to replace, and that'll be the questions we're going to have answered.
So in simple terms, that's where we got it before COVID came around, added to the problems. Then we got this money to kind of help with that and new problems. And now we're going to have to go back to the old funding to try and continue the new problems that we have to try and tend to. Is that it?
I think that's.
Perfect. I got to write that down because I'm going to have to use it. That's exactly how we need to put it.
As someone more on the outside, I would say, start thinking long and hard right now about the fiscal 24-25 budget. As David was saying, budget versus ACFR, forward-looking versus in the books. What are you going to be planning for the 24-25 fiscal year? Because you're going to be able to project X amount of revenue coming in and Y amount of need that's got to be addressed.
and
And you'll still have grants, but there's probably not going to total $170 million in grants.
And maybe to put it in perspective and follow up with what Superintendent Taylor just shared, of that almost $500 million of one-time funding we received, the vast majority of it we only spent on things we could spend one time and we know we're not committed to. That said, there were about $34-ish million worth of things out of that almost $500 million that we did say, oh, we do want to keep doing these things after this one-time funding is gone. And to wit, and as Dr. Taylor said, we put some behavioral support positions, school counselors, social workers on this funding. And so that's where you may recall during budget times, we've been talking about fiscal transition. We've got this some $30 million hole to fill. And we've got that $30 million down closer to $20 million now, based upon our budget reconciliation. And back to Mr. Hepburn's point, as we look at next year's budget, we still have that $22 million gap to fill, because we do intend to continue those things.
I was just going to say what David just shared in last year's budget, or this current budget. You'll remember we talked about the fiscal transition and moving some of those things last year so that we didn't have this larger number for this coming budget year. So we've begun that process, but TBD and certainly not done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we'll now take a deeper dive into our fund balance. You'll turn to page 75. You'll see on the schedule of revenues, expenditure, and changes in fund balance. In your actual column for 2023, down at the bottom, you'll see fund balance end of year at $126.3 million. Right next to that in the variance column is $9.3 million. This is a result of savings from underutilized budget and lapsed salaries from vacant positions. And we'll now go to pages 17 and 18 to look at the different categories of the fund balance. And so you heard terms like restricted, unassigned, and assigned, and we're actually going to just take a deeper dive into that. So in the far left column, midway down the page, once again, you'll see total fund balances at $126.3 million. And it starts with the non-spendable inventories category at $4.8 million. This consists of the non-spendable inventories and prepaid expenditures, items such as maintenance and instructional warehouse and transportation. These items represent the inventory categories where the funding has been spent and is not available for use. We next go down into the line for restricted, which includes the accounts receivable and carry forward purchase order encumbrances at $5.8 million. The funds in this category are restricted by state statute and not available for use. The next section in assigned fund balance, we'll skip over special projects because I'm going to come back to that and talk about something on the board agenda this evening. But if you look at your insurance line, it's $20.4 million. This includes the school system self-insurance. So this includes our dental and our workers' compensation and a reserve for liability and property claims and premiums. This reserve was established to cover potential claims below the plan's deductible limits. The school system has increased the deductible over the past 5 years to maintain affordable premiums. Our current deductibles range from $25,000 to $250,000. The next line is the potential unfunded pension liability. It's designated at $3.6 million. A report is provided monthly to the board in closed session regarding this item. The next line for flexible benefits is $1 million. The balance of funds collected from employees and not spent to date for medical and dependent care flex accounts. Our next line, and you've heard this in the budget piece with the subsequent year's expenditures, so this is what the board is committed to balance the budget. This amount is above the board policy requirement of appropriating 50% of the prior year's unassigned fund balance, and the board waived this policy when approving the budget earlier this year. Yes.
And I want to recall for the board, if you recall back in October when we brought you recommendations to reconcile the current year's budget, the recommendation, and there were a series of additional costs beyond what the board had in their proposed budget, as well as some savings, but still there was a net $3.9 million that we had to find to balance the budget. And our recommendation was to use an additional $3.9 million of this unassigned fund balance. So that what's showing as of June 30th, the $52.5 million is really now, after that recommendation, now less. It's really now closer to $48.6 million because of that recommendation. And that subsequent year's expenditure line, the amount of fund balance we're putting in to balance the current year's budget based on that recommendation is now closer to $29.1 million. So again, this is a snapshot in place, but again, the budget keeps moving.
Thank you. All right. So next, we'll look at the unassigned fund balance, and we have some additional notes on that. Best practices recommend using the fund balance for one-time expenditures or in emergencies. Appropriation for recurring expenditures places the board at risk in the following budget year. We did some different calculations. The board policy 8101 undesignated operating fund balance, which is the same as the unassigned fund balance. That in itself, let me see, works off of the budget and not expenditures. So our percentages are a little different than Mr. Beatty's because he was using expenditures versus budget. So we showed the unassigned is 2.3% of the total operating budget from fiscal year 2023 and 8.2% of the subsequent year's county appropriation budget. David, did you want to add another?
Yeah, I would just add a couple things here. And if you'll recall back, Ms. Posey had a graph, and actually, could you click back? It was the graph,
Yeah,
the
that's
fund balance.
Right down, there you go.
Yeah. You'll see over time, and let's look at perhaps the orange line. That's what I'm speaking specifically to. But you'll see after 2019 and 2020, that orange line starts popping up, and you see an overall upwards trend. That is in the unassigned fund balance, and the unassigned fund balance is really the one piece of the overall fund balance that the board can directly control. It's not pre-designated for something else or untouchable for some other reason. And that's been going up because we've been able to, we've had the additional COVID funds allowing us to basically build that up. And if you went back, don't change slides, but if you were able to go back to like the 2008 to 2014 time frame, you'd see a similar upward trends on that unassigned fund balance. And that too was by design. That was during the Great Recession, where we built those funds up for the express purpose that Mr. Beatty shared, knowing that we've got this fiscal transition or fiscal cliff, as some people like to refer to, of we've got ongoing expenditures, and we know this one-time federal funding during the Great Recession was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funding. During the pandemic, it was primarily the ESSER funding, but was built up to give us a bridge to continue to do the things we want to keep doing, knowing that one-time funding is dropping off. So I would anticipate if we fast forwarded 3 or 4 years, and barring some other unforeseen situation requiring some uptick of federal funding, that those trend lines on total fund balance and unassigned fund balance over the next several years are going to start trending down. And the last thing I would share, and can you go back to the current slide, Ms. Josie? You'll see that the current unassigned fund balance as of June 30th represents 8.2% of the overall county appropriation. And the board has a policy that says if it's in excess of 6%, and it is, that any amounts over that would be returned to the county. We will come to the board at your next meeting in December and ask the board to waive that policy as we have for the past several years, as we've intentionally built this amount up, such that we can maintain it in the board's unassigned fund balance. But again, we'll bring that at your next meeting. We'll provide a much more detailed explanation then.
Can I chime in again as an outsider? To me, as I look at this, one of the challenges I see is what you're talking about is this is operating days of money on hand that's not otherwise claimed. And from a financial planner's perspective, it is not enough. But as Mr. Nieder just explained, you're in opposition to the County Board of Supervisors in terms of building this up more because of that policy. So an encouragement as y'all continue to look at this over the coming years is figure out the negotiating process to allow the school district to actually have more days of funding kept on hand. I don't know how you do it, but that's why you're on the school board and I haven't run yet.
Thank you. And so one last thing that I want to point out here, Mr. Beatty referenced 10 days of operating funds. Since we operate year-round, our calculation is not based on the standard 180 days. So for us, it actually is an average of about 6 to 7 days. So I am going to come back to special projects now. And also, if you can turn to page 60 in your book, because this is going to give you a list of the items in special projects. Tonight on the consent agenda is a request to appropriate $2.7 million of the special projects to cover one-time program needs. $10.1 million of the special projects was appropriated by the board earlier in the school year to assist with immediate district needs. So on page 160, the targeted enrollment of $7.4 million, textbooks of $1.1 million, the Work Together initiatives, that tutoring initiative of $485,000, our before and after school support of $176,000, and the Oracle upgrade of $914,000. So those items make up the $10.1 million that the board has already appropriated this year. So reserves such as insurance, the pension liability, and flexible benefits will remain in the fund balance until needed. All assigned fund balance categories are restricted for use and committed to a purpose and cannot be appropriated for other uses. Are there any questions about the request or items on this list? All right. So lastly, we like to look at the positive and our contribution and impact on our economy. So aside from financial numbers in this document, the school system employed over 20,000 employees in fiscal year 2023. We're also not tax exempt, so we do contribute to our sales tax. The contributions shown on this slide total $1.7 billion contributed to the local economy. So our payroll at $1.2 billion. You see our matching retirement and insurance, so close to 500 million, as well as our state payroll, federal payroll taxes, local sales taxes that we do receive a refund, but we receive it in the following fiscal year, not the current fiscal year. and then our state non-refundable taxes at that 3.2 million. So just wanted to highlight some of those things, the contributions to our local economy. All right. Any questions?
Thank you for taking us on a little bit deeper of a dive, especially around our fund balance, which we haven't got as many questions as we usually do, but oftentimes that is mostly the questions we get is our fund balance. Any questions? I think we asked them following along, so,
Great. Looks like we're running out of time.
yes.
Well, thank you for your time today, and thank you for our guest speakers and presenters.
Thanks for letting me ask questions.
Thank you for your participation and support. I do think it's important that the community is aware that we do have an audit committee that is made up of external partners, which is why we continue to be stellar at the way we do our fiscal business and noted so by awards. And of course, thank you to all of the background people that we rarely ever see, but we know that there are lots of hands touching this to make us a great financial institution. And I cannot imagine keeping up with a roster of other people. But we want our money back, so we appreciate that. We don't want to pay bills and we don't have to pay, so thank you all for your support. I appreciate it.
Madam Chair, if I could, I'll say that Ms. Posey has done a great job her first go around. She and David met with me to kind of go through the audit, and I don't know why she was nervous, but I had a million questions and she answered every one. So that's one of the things that I look for, to make sure that they understand the audit and can share the information with me. So hats off to you, Ms. Posey.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for staying with us, Tyler. We appreciate it.
always good to see you.
Again, thank you for your support. I'm glad to hear the majority of our folks are remaining on our audit committee, so I don't have to make my little announcement because you were not at our meeting, so I wasn't sure.
Well, we still, I'd like to put forward the name of Nate Branscombe to come onto this committee. He is community involved, he is a CPA, he is interested and willing, but it is up to the board to decide whether or not he is able to serve, basically under the sponsorship of one of the board members. And he sent me an email today saying, what's the next step? And I didn't respond because I didn't know the next step.
So the next step is actually you put that in writing to David, Tricia, the superintendent, and I. And then we will, I don't have it. Then once we have it, it will, and I'm sure Mr. Reed is very thorough. The superintendent also has the option to make an appointment too, which I was not going to make that piece of my note public, but you, so technically there could be potentially more than one person coming on. But once you send that to us, it'll go to the full board, and the full board would get information prior to a vote.
And it's just the one vacancy right now that you have?
Technically, there's one, go ahead.
There are 6 voting members on this committee that the board nominates, and I believe we will have one vacancy.
So that's why I didn't answer that question, because we don't know yet. That was the point of this meeting.
We'll
We
definitely
don't know
have
yet.
one vacancy, and we'd like to have another vacancy.
But we don't. The only vacancy we know that we have is a superintendent's appointment.
And the superintendent
rest
also,
we are not
beyond
sure.
those 6
That's
voting
right.
members, the superintendent has a voting member that he can nominate, and we've spoken with him about that. And the finance committee chair serves as a member of the committee, and then there's one other non-voting member that's been appointed, and at this point, that is Mustin.
Right. Perfect. But we will send you all of that information once we know if there's a voting member coming off. Thank you.
It feels like things happen.